The population groups of the Yungan Nukumba people of the Kimberley region and the Iranian asylum seekers in offshore detention share the tragic similarity of high suicide rates. In the far north of Western Australia, the Aboriginal population makes up 45% of the Kimberley region. During 2011 and 2015, suicide was the leading cause of death in Kimberley's 15 to 24-year-olds. 42% of people in detention were Iranian asylum seekers. And since 2017, 3 Iranian men have died from suicide or suspected suicide in offshore detention. Alongside the other factors of impacting high suicide rates of these populations, it is vital to consider the depth of the many historical factors. The intergenerational trauma, cultural dislocation, and loss of identity and practices of the Yungan people of the Kimberley region are identified as directly resulting in poor mental health and high risks of suicide. One of the earliest settled parts of Australia, the unique and ancient lifestyle of the Yungan Nukumba people was disrupted by white settlement in the 1830s, and hence named the Kimberley district in 1879. Their everyday life, social and kinship systems, beliefs, rituals, and language were demonized. The fundamentals of Aboriginal culture leading the lives of the Yungan people, the relationship with the natural world, land and sea, the importance of language, the dreaming, the law, were all taken from them. The Nukumba became a sheep station in the Kimberley district in 1880. Aboriginal people were massacred to make way for this industry, and those that were survived were forced to work. As late as 1956, Aboriginal prisoners in the Kimberley were still being secured by neck chains. Whilst experiencing the tragic governmental act of the stolen generation, the Yungan peoples were also fighting for the rights to live and control in their land. The multinational mining exploration company, AMAX, backed by the right-wing court Liberal state government, battled with the Yungan peoples for 2 years before they eventually proceeded to mine on their sacred land in the 1980s. The impact of this battle in the Nukumba region transcended into the current social issues affecting the lives of the Yungan people today. The systemic racism, lower socioeconomic conditions, and ongoing marginalization of this population, in conjunction with the eternal historical trauma, relates to the poor mental health and high suicide rates of the Kimberley's Aboriginal population. The exposure to racism, cultural and language differences, and a lack of understanding and communication has resulted in the mistrust of mainstream health services. Hence, the Yungan people's access to quality mental health care is severely inadequate. This creates a huge demand for action on this issue, as suicide rates are increasing. As of April 2021, there were 240 Iranian asylum seekers still in offshore detention. Likewise, for the Yungan people, these Iranians have strong links to their ancient cultures. They also value family and community above all else, and this long-term and traumatic separation from their families naturally results in anxiety and depression. In addition, the experience of fleeing from their homeland, ridden with economic and political turmoil, acts also as a source for their high risk of suicide. As a group of studying health professionals, our passion lies with lowering the suicide rates of these two population groups. It involves expansion of services, community-based approaches, video conferencing, and telehealth. Also, emphasis on culture and country funding by regional and national government bodies.
As health practitioners, we need to improve the social and emotional well-being of young Aboriginal Australians. Aboriginal children and young adults represent 28% of all recorded suicide deaths of children and young people, despite comprising 3% of Australia's population. Suicide rates of Aboriginal people in certain areas of Western Australia are amongst the highest of anywhere in the world. Rates of Aboriginal youth have continued to increase, making young Aboriginal people at high risk. In far north of Western Australia, the Aboriginal population makes up 45% of the Kimberley region. The Kimberley region of Western Australia has the unfortunate and tragic claim to be home to one of the world's highest suicide rates. Factors which place Aboriginal youth at risk include social, economical, loss of land and identity. Sociocultural determinants include at-sea groups having experienced loss of land, first settlement, loss of identity and culture. Socioeconomic determinants include young Aboriginals having an overall lower status, lower levels of education due to living in rural and remote areas, with only 3.3% of the Kimberley region were attending TAFE or uni compared to Metro's 7.3%. Low levels of employment, with around 1/3 of Indigenous people experience stress due to not being able to get a job, which leads to lower income. The most prevalent long-term health condition reported by young Indigenous people were respiratory diseases such as asthma and eye or vision problems. The burden of these diseases show that for Indigenous people, the leading contributors to the disease burden were suicide and self-inflicted injuries. The youth suicide rates for males is 8 times higher and females 6 times higher in the Kimberley than the state's suicide rates. The need to support children's mental health is evidenced by the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Survey results, displaying 32% of adolescents reported higher levels of physiological distress. Alongside the current factors that impact this population, it is vital to consider the depths of many historical factors such as the stolen generation, high levels of vulnerability which result in mental health. Aboriginal mental health problems are not always well understood by mainstream healthcare providers, which lead to low levels of these services being utilised. Healthcare services need to be engaging Aboriginal communities in designing and delivering healthcare to tackle this issue. By creating community engagement and identifying their healthcare service needs and translating them to the actions by local health services and increasing their trust in these services. Mental health care services and interventions are not accessible due to the remoteness in the Kimberley. The high rates of mental health on the community is a result of lack of services to them, and specific needs need to be catered to the community in the Kimberley region.
So in the time period of 2005 to 2014, there are 102 Indigenous deaths from suicide. If this is age adjusted, the suicide rate of Indigenous people in the Kimberley is 74 per 100,000. When applied separately to men and women, men have a rate of 117 per 100,000 and women's is 39.5 per 100,000. This in perspective, the non-Indigenous suicide rate in the Kimberley region is 10 per 100,000, while the Australian national suicide rate is 12.1 per 100,000. Suicide in the Kimberley has become such a concern that the Coroner's Court launched the inquest into the 13 deaths of children and young persons in the Kimberley region. Of these 13 deaths, one of the children was only 10 years old. Our second group are Iranian asylum seekers in offshore detention. Like the Yungungora people of the Kimberley, they too have a high suicide rate. Between 2013 and 2017, 42% of people in detention were Iranian. As of April 2021, there are only 240 people still in offshore detention. Although there is no data on the country of origin of the people, it is likely that Iranians still remain in offshore detention. Since 2017, 3 Iranian men have died from suicide or suspected suicide. The Yungungora and Iranians share similarities in other less expected ways. They both have strong ancient links to cultures. The Iranians still deeply identify with the Persian Empire. This is shown in that the official state language of Iran, Farsi, is also known as Persian. Iranians are a diverse people. However, despite this diversity, Iranians still see each other as Havmante, which in English roughly translates to something like fellow citizen. They are also strongly family-oriented, and as such, separation from their family is a great source of anxiety and depression. However, there are some important differences. In regards to family structure, the Iranians have a more nuclear family structure that's more similar to a Western culture, whereas the Indigenous group, they have an extended family structure. Unlike the Yungungora, who were in Australia before colonisation, the Iranians are fleeing their homeland because of economic and political factors. As such, they see Australia as an escape rather than a land being occupied. This is demonstrated by the facts of newly immigrated Iranian immigrants talking about the harsh conditions of their home country. And by repeating this, it makes them feel grateful to be in Australia. So how does our strategy help? With our readings and research, we have developed a strategy of returning autonomy to the Yungungora people through the human rights model, as well as expanding the use of remote video conferencing. We believe this will better address the social determinants of health, such as family, culture, community, connection to land, and intergenerational trauma. This allows them to express treatments of mental health conditions such as suicide through traditional use of land, language, their own laws, and law.
Our strategy in approaching suicide prevention among the Yungora people of Nukungba community of the Kimberley is multi-pronged. It involves expansion of services, community-based approaches, emphasis on culture and country, and funding by regional and national governmental bodies. Remote communities, such as the Yungora of the Kimberley, need an expansion of accessible services. This means that health centers need an increase in suicide prevention education among their staff and to have units with clinical staff that focus on mental health emergencies. These units must have staff, in this case, that identify as Yungora. While new clinics and health centers cannot be built overnight, an alternative is to have members of the community already on country empowered to support those suffering from self-harm and suicidal ideation. Another method of prevention is crisis response teams. Designated members of the community, typically from clinical roles, who meet with individuals in the community following one or a series of self-harm or suicide incidents. Being trained in crisis response would best fit my role as a paramedic, as we serve specific communities and need to be aware of our community's prevailing health needs. From a community-based standpoint, one method developed is primordial prevention. This is the understanding of colonial history and its impact on contemporary lives, addressing intergenerational trauma and exclusion from broader society. Primordial prevention also addresses social determinants of health, such as employment, education, social connection and community, and exposure to trauma. An upstream approach that addresses these social determinants is the National Empowerment Project, which develops, delivers, and evaluates programs that promote positive social and emotional well-being. Using an SEW framework, they focus on individuals, families, and communities. The most respected members of the Aboriginal communities are the elders, who are seen to guide the youth generation. When discussing youth suicide and self-harm, they continue to emphasize the importance of culture and country. They see the best remedy as a strong connection to one's own mob. Elder Dean Gouda of Fitzroy Crossing has spoken with the youth of his community and seeks to implement what they had said, which would lead to better suicide prevention outcomes. This exemplifies the roles elders play in supporting the cultural needs of their community in suicide prevention. Elders are seen as the arbiters of dance, language, and culture, and with the proper support can expand formal and informal application of these practices. To empower community leaders, such as elders, is to allocate the appropriate amount of funding. State and national governments need to free resources to these communities, allowing self-determination in their distribution. One place distribution that has proven to be effective is on community centers. Concerning the Yungora people, their allocation to the Kimberley Aboriginal Lore and Cultural Center is regarded as an already established cultural place that, with increased funding, can allow for programs that combine culture and suicide prevention. CALIC has continually sought to redirect funds away from clinical or Western health approaches and direct it towards their program, the Iramin Project, that directly engages with Yungora and other Aboriginal youth of the Kimberley to maintain and expand cultural practices proven to reduce risk factors of suicide and self-harm. Now, to adapt our strategy for Iranian asylum seekers, we need to consider the same factors as the Yungora community. These are expanding access and redirecting funds. In the Iranian context, asylum seekers need better access to health and well-being centered on their cultural and possibly religious identity. They also need access to their community outside detention. This can take the form of allowing them to communicate with those in Iran or already settled Iranians in Australia, either of which may be family or members of one of their diverse communities of Iran. They also need broader access to translators that can facilitate mental health support and suicide prevention. Translators can also be used as the best prevention of all, which is to facilitate legal aid used to free them from offshore detention and be settled in Australia. Concerning access is the funding needed to allow for these measures. Similarly to the Ngora, Iranian asylum seekers would benefit overall from a redirection of funding and resources, and for them, away from detention and to settlement programs that seek to prepare and provide them with a healthy and stable life in Australia.
So how can our specialties help? Annika and myself would be looking at it from a occupational therapist perspective. So the way I do this is provide assistive technology to the elders involved, and also those who are living with disabilities.
We will also provide cognitive assessments, interventions, and treatment to assist these population groups who are suffering with poor mental health so they can return to functional living. And in addition, we will also provide group programs and return to work support and development of independent living skills.
And as stated, as a paramedic, it would best to be trained in crisis response specific to self-harm and suicide in the community that we serve.
In sports science, we could create a sports program for young Indigenous people to participate in, to use as a distraction, or to keep them occupied to avoid young people from feeling alone.